September 15th, 1976. The rain tapped against the windows of St. Helena Catholic School in Manhattan as 14-year-old Claire Jennings vanished without a trace after catechism class. Her mother Dolores waited by the school gates, clutching a broken umbrella, never knowing that her daughter's final words that morning would haunt her for 3 decades. "Mom, I need to tell you something important. But after class, okay?" Claire never came home to tell her secret. 30 years later, construction workers renovating the church confessional made a discovery that would shatter everything the community believed about that September day. Hidden behind a false wall, they found a metal box containing documents, photographs, and a cassette tape labeled "Forgiveness" in faded handwriting. When that tape began to play, it revealed a conspiracy so dark and systematic that it would expose decades of institutional cover-ups, missing children, and a network of predators who used sacred spaces to commit unspeakable crimes. But the most devastating revelation was yet to come. In the basement of that same school, investigators would uncover evidence that Claire had left behind, a final message that would not only solve the mystery of her disappearance, but reveal that the man who discovered the original confession tape was connected to the case in ways that no one could have imagined. Some secrets are buried so deep that only divine intervention can bring them to light, and sometimes justice comes from the most unexpected places. If you want to hear more incredible true stories that will leave you speechless, make sure to subscribe to our channel, hit that like button, and let us know in the comments what state or country you're watching from. Your support helps us bring these important stories to light. The rain tapped against the windows of St. Helena Catholic School like impatient fingers, each drop echoing through the empty hallways of Manhattan's Upper East Side. It was September 15th, 1976, and the world outside buzzed with the energy of a city that never slept. But inside the wrought iron gates of the prestigious Catholic institution, time seemed to move differently, slower, heavier, weighted with the kind of silence that makes mothers' hearts race. Dolores Rivera clutched her broken umbrella with calloused hands, the same hands that had scrubbed floors at the Presbyterian hospital since dawn. Her worn navy coat, a hand-me-down from her employer's wife, hung loosely on her small frame as she peered through the rain-streaked glass doors. At 38, Dolores carried the weight of 2 jobs, a deceased husband, and the fierce love only a single mother could understand. Her dark eyes, rimmed with exhaustion but bright with devotion, searched desperately for a familiar figure among the empty corridors. Claire should have been out by now. Her daughter, 14 years old, with sandy brown hair that caught sunlight like spun gold, and eyes the color of autumn leaves, always emerged from catechism class at exactly 4:15 p.m. Always. Claire was nothing if not punctual, a trait she'd inherited from her late father, a construction worker who died in a scaffolding accident when she was just 7. But today, the clock above the school's entrance read 4:47 p.m., and the halls were as empty as a tomb. "Excuse me, sister," Dolores called to an elderly nun who was methodically collecting prayer books from the chapel pews. Sister Margaret, her wimple slightly askew, looked up with the kind of tired patience that came from 50 years of dealing with worried parents. "Yes, child?" Sister Margaret's voice carried the faint trace of an Irish accent that decades in New York hadn't quite erased. "My daughter, Claire Jennings. She was in Father McKenna's catechism class today. Have you seen her?" Dolores's voice cracked slightly, betraying the fear she was trying to suppress. Sister Margaret's weathered face softened with what might have been recognition, or perhaps concern. She set down the stack of books and studied Dolores with eyes that had seen too much of life's cruelties. "Claire, the Puerto Rican girl with the white ribbon in her hair?" "Yes, that's her. She always wears that ribbon. It was her father's." Dolores's voice trailed off, her throat tightening with emotion. The nun's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, a flicker of something that looked like guilt, or maybe fear. I haven't seen her since morning mass. Perhaps you should speak with Father Malcolm." Father Malcolm. The name alone made Dolores's skin crawl. The school's director was a tall, austere man in his 50s, with cold gray eyes and a voice that could freeze summer rain. He'd made it clear from Claire's first day at St. Helena that scholarship students, especially those from families like theirs, were there on borrowed grace. Dolores found him in his office, an imposing room lined with leather-bound theology books and crucifixes that seemed to watch her every move. Father Malcolm barely looked up from his paperwork when she knocked. "Father Malcolm, I'm looking for my daughter, Claire Jennings. She didn't come out of catechism class today." The priest's pen continued scratching across the paper for several long seconds before he finally raised his head. His gray eyes assessed Dolores with the same expression one might reserve for an unwelcome stain on expensive fabric. "Miss Rivera," he said, deliberately mispronouncing her surname. "Young girls these days are becoming increasingly irresponsible. Perhaps your daughter has simply chosen to engage in some adolescent foolishness rather than return home to her duties." The words hit Dolores like a physical blow. "Sir, with all respect, Claire isn't that kind of girl. She's never missed a class, never been late coming home. Something is wrong." Father Malcolm set down his pen with deliberate slowness and leaned back in his chair. "Mrs. Rivera, I understand your maternal anxiety. But let me be clear. This institution has maintained an impeccable reputation for over 60 years. We do not simply lose children. If your daughter is missing, I suggest you look to your own community for answers." The dismissal was clear, but Dolores refused to move. Her maternal instincts were screaming that something terrible had happened, and she wouldn't be intimidated by this man's cold authority. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Just help me look for her, please." For a moment, something flickered across Father Malcolm's face. Was it fear? Guilt? But it was gone so quickly that Dolores wondered if she'd imagined it. "The school is closed, Mrs. Rivera. I suggest you contact the police if you're truly concerned. Good day." As Dolores walked through the empty halls one final time, calling Claire's name into the echoing silence, she passed the basement door. For just a moment, she could have sworn she heard something, a faint sound like crying coming from below. But when she tried the handle, it was locked, and Father Malcolm's voice echoed from his office, dismissing her fears as the paranoia of an overwrought mother. That night, Dolores sat in their tiny apartment above Morelli's Deli on 82nd Street, staring at Claire's empty bed. The police officer who'd finally agreed to take her report had been kind but ineffective. Another runaway Puerto Rican teenager he'd suggested, probably off with some boy from the neighborhood. But Dolores knew better. She knew her daughter. As rain continued to streak the windows, Dolores remembered Claire's last words that morning. Her daughter had been unusually quiet during their walk to school, fidgeting with the white satin ribbon that had belonged to her father, the one memento they'd saved from the accident. "Mommy," Claire had said as they reached the school gates, her young voice heavy with an emotion Dolores couldn't quite identify. "I need to tell you something important, but not here. After catechism class, okay? When I get home." Dolores had smiled and kissed her daughter's forehead, tasting the lingering sweetness of the café con leche they'd shared for breakfast. "Of course, mi amor. Whatever it is, we'll figure it out together." But Claire never came home, and whatever secret she'd been carrying died with her in the shadows of St. Helena Catholic School. As Dolores finally fell into an exhausted sleep at 3 a.m., she couldn't know that 30 years would pass before that secret would claw its way back to the surface, carried on the voice of a dead man and the testimony of a broken cassette tape hidden behind the walls of the very confessional where she now prayed every Sunday for her daughter's soul. The white ribbon Claire had worn that day would never be found. But the truth it witnessed would eventually demand to be heard, no matter how deeply it had been buried in the hallowed ground of lies and institutional silence. In her dreams that night, Dolores heard Claire calling for her, a distant, desperate voice echoing from somewhere dark and cold, somewhere that smelled of disinfectant and fear. But when she tried to reach for her daughter's hand, she found nothing but empty air and the lingering scent of white gardenias, Claire's favorite flowers. She woke with tears on her cheeks and a certainty in her heart that would never fade. Her daughter had tried to come home. Someone, or something, had stopped her. 30 years had carved their relentless passage across Dolores Rivera's face like a sculptor working with weathered stone. The laugh lines that had once danced around her eyes during Claire's childhood had deepened into permanent furrows of grief, and her once thick black hair now hung in silver threads beneath the worn headscarf she'd taken to wearing during her morning prayers. At 68, her hands moved with the practiced rhythm of someone who had spent 3 decades scrubbing floors, washing dishes, and polishing pews, always searching for something that could never be cleaned away. The morning sun filtered through the stained glass windows of St. Helena Church, casting rainbow patterns across the marble floor that Dolores methodically mopped with industrial-strength cleaner. The familiar smell of pine disinfectant and old wood had become the soundtrack to her grieving, a daily ritual that began at 5 a.m. and ended only when every surface gleamed with the kind of perfection that comes from desperate devotion. She had never left this neighborhood. Even when well-meaning social workers and church ladies had suggested she might find peace elsewhere, somewhere without the constant reminder of her loss, Dolores had refused. This was where Claire had walked to school each morning. This was where her daughter's footsteps were embedded in the sidewalk cracks, where her laughter still echoed in the wind that swept down from Central Park. To leave would be to abandon the last traces of the girl who had been her entire world. The new priest, Father Martinez, was nothing like the cold, calculating Father Malcolm, who had died in that suspicious car accident back in 1994. Father Martinez was young, perhaps 40, with kind brown eyes that reminded Dolores of her late husband's gentle nature. He spoke Spanish during confession and never made her feel like a charity case when she lit candles for Claire's soul every Sunday after Mass. "Buenos dias, Señora Rivera," Father Martinez called from the altar where he was arranging fresh lilies for the morning service. "How are you feeling today?" Dolores paused in her mopping, wringing out the gray water that had collected in her bucket. The question was more than politeness. Father Martinez had noticed the way she sometimes stopped mid-task, staring at empty spaces as if she could see her daughter's ghost playing in the shadows. "Some days are harder than others, Padre," she replied, her English still carrying the musical cadence of her native Puerto Rico, despite 43 years in New York. "Today feels different somehow, like something is going to change." Father Martinez nodded with the understanding of someone who had seen how grief could sharpen intuition, how loss could make a person sensitive to shifts in the spiritual atmosphere that others might dismiss as imagination. The renovation had been going on for 3 weeks now. The church board had finally approved the funds to restore the confession booth area, which had fallen into disrepair after a small flood in the basement had damaged the supporting walls. Dolores had watched the construction workers with a mixture of curiosity and dread. There was something unsettling about disturbing spaces that had held so many secrets, so many whispered admissions of guilt and pleas for forgiveness. It was Miguel Santos, the lead contractor, who made the discovery that would change everything. A soft-spoken man in his 50s who attended evening mass with his wife and twin daughters, Miguel had been carefully removing the water-damaged panels behind the old confessional when his crowbar struck something that definitely wasn't wood or plaster. "Padre Martinez," Miguel called out, his voice echoing through the church with an urgency that made Dolores stop cleaning and look up from her work. "You need to see this." Father Martinez hurried over, his shoes clicking against the marble floor, while Dolores found herself drawn toward the commotion despite her usual instinct to avoid drawing attention to herself. Behind the false wall that had concealed decades of moisture damage, Miguel had uncovered a metal box about the size of a shoebox, its surface green with age and oxidation. The lock had long since rusted away, and when Father Martinez carefully opened the lid, the smell that escaped was a mixture of mold, old paper, and something else. Something that reminded Dolores of the hospital where she'd worked as a young woman, that antiseptic scent that clung to places where people suffered in silence. Inside were documents, yellowed papers with official letterheads from the archdiocese, correspondence that looked deliberately hidden rather than accidentally lost. But it was the object at the bottom of the box that made Father Martinez's face pale. A cassette tape in a cracked plastic case, with a handwritten label that had faded to barely legible script. The word "perdón," forgiveness, was still visible in what looked like a man's hurried handwriting. "This must be very old," Father Martinez murmured, turning the tape over in his hands. "These documents, they're from the 1970s and 80s. Dolores felt her heart begin to race, though she couldn't explain why. There was something about the way the cassette looked, abandoned but carefully preserved, hidden but meant to be found, that made her think of all the secrets this church had held during the darkest period of her life. "Padre," she said quietly, approaching with the deference she'd learned from decades of being dismissed by authority figures, May I see that?" Father Martinez looked at her with surprise. In all the years she'd worked at the church, Dolores had never asked for anything beyond her modest salary and the occasional ride home during particularly harsh winter storms. She was the kind of employee who made herself invisible, who performed her duties with such quiet efficiency that she became part of the building itself. When he handed her the tape, Dolores felt a strange sensation, as if the plastic case were warm to the touch despite having been locked away in a cold, damp space for decades. The label was written in Spanish, in the careful script of someone who had learned English as a second language but still thought in their native tongue when emotions ran high. "I don't have a way to play this here at the church," Father Martinez said apologetically. "The equipment we have is all modern now. But perhaps—" "My neighbor," Dolores said suddenly, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. "Senor Alonso, he fixes electronic things, old radios, televisions. He might have something that could play this." Father Martinez studied her face, noting the intensity in her eyes that hadn't been there moments before. There was something about this discovery that had awakened something in Dolores, a spark of hope or perhaps recognition, that transformed her from the quietly grieving cleaning woman into someone with purpose. "Of course," he said gently. "If it helps bring closure to whatever story this tape contains, then it belongs in the hands of someone who cares enough to listen." As Dolores walked home that evening, the cassette tape wrapped carefully in a clean dish rag and tucked into her purse, she felt Claire's presence more strongly than she had in years. The autumn air carried the scent of dying leaves and the first hint of winter's approach, but underneath it all was something else, the faint sweetness of white gardenias, Claire's favorite flowers, blooming impossibly out of season. That night, she placed the tape on her nightstand next to the framed photo of Claire in her confirmation dress, white lace and satin ribbons, with that radiant smile that had made everyone who met her fall instantly in love with her gentle spirit. In the photo, Claire's hands were folded in prayer, but her eyes looked directly at the camera with an expression that now seemed almost prophetic, as if she'd known that this moment would someday serve as a bridge between her life and whatever truth lay waiting to be discovered. Senor Alonso Vega lived in apartment 4B of the same weathered brick building where Dolores had raised Claire, a 6-story tenement that had housed generations of immigrants chasing the American dream through the narrow streets of Manhattan's Upper East Side. At 74, his gnarled fingers still possessed the delicate precision of a master craftsman, capable of coaxing life from the most hopeless electronic devices. His small apartment was a museum of rescued technology. Vintage radios from the 1940s hummed alongside modern televisions he'd rebuilt from spare parts, creating a symphony of static and distant voices that kept him company during the long, lonely hours since his wife Maria had passed 5 years ago. The knock on his door that crisp October morning came just as he was adjusting the antenna on a 1960s Philips radio for Mrs. Chen down the hall. Dolores stood in the hallway clutching a worn leather purse against her chest, her eyes carrying that particular blend of hope and desperation he'd seen too many times in their neighborhood, the look of someone who had exhausted all conventional options and was now reaching toward something that might be either salvation or heartbreak. "Senora Rivera," he said, opening the door wider and gesturing her into his cramped but meticulously organized living room. "What brings you to my workshop this morning?" Dolores perched nervously on the edge of his threadbare sofa, the same green velour couch where Maria used to sit and watch him work, offering gentle commentary and café cubano during his more challenging repairs. The apartment smelled like WD-40, old electrical components, and the lingering ghost of Maria's gardenia perfume that still clung to the curtains she'd sewn by hand 30 years ago. "Senor Alonso," Dolores began, her voice barely above a whisper, "I found something at the church." A tape. A very old cassette tape. Father Martinez said maybe you could... She trailed off, pulling the cassette from her purse with the reverent care someone might use to handle a religious relic. Alonzo adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and examined the tape with the practiced eye of someone who had seen thousands of similar objects pass through his hands. The plastic case was cracked along one edge and the label had faded to a barely legible scrawl, but the tape inside appeared intact. What struck him immediately was the weight of the object. Not its physical weight, but the emotional gravity that seemed to radiate from something so small and ordinary. "Where did this come from?" he asked, though something in his gut was already providing answers he didn't want to acknowledge. "Hidden behind a wall in the confessional. It's been there for decades, maybe since..." Dolores's voice caught in her throat. "Maybe since Claire disappeared." The name hit Alonzo like a physical blow. He had known Claire, of course. In their tight-knit neighborhood, everyone knew everyone else's children, watched them grow up, celebrated their confirmations and graduations. Claire had been the kind of child who said "buenos dias" to every neighbor she passed, who helped elderly residents carry groceries up the narrow staircases, who possessed that rare combination of intelligence and kindness that made adults secretly hope their own children would turn out half as wonderful. He had also known about the shadow that had fallen over the Rivera family when she vanished. He remembered the police cars parked outside the building, the whispered conversations in the laundromat about what might have happened to such a good girl, the way Dolores had aged a decade in the span of a single month. What he had never told anyone, what he had carried like a stone in his chest for 30 years, was his own connection to St. Helena Catholic School. "Let me see what I can do," he said carefully, walking toward a cabinet where he kept his collection of vintage audio equipment. His hands were trembling slightly, and he hoped Dolores wouldn't notice. The cassette player he selected was a 1970 Sony model that he'd restored to perfect working condition just 6 months ago. As he inserted the tape and pressed play, the silence in the room became so complete that he could hear his own heartbeat drumming against his ribs. The first few seconds produced nothing but the soft hiss of old magnetic tape, and then a voice emerged from the speakers, male, middle-aged, speaking in the measured cadences of someone accustomed to delivering sermons. But this wasn't a sermon. This was something much more personal, much more desperate. "Forgive me, Father, for I have sinned," the voice began, and Alonzo's blood turned to ice water in his veins. He recognized that voice. Even after all these years, even distorted by the limitations of decades-old recording equipment, he knew exactly who was speaking. "Father Malcolm." Alonzo's finger moved toward the stop button, but Dolores leaned forward, her entire body tense with attention. "Is that?" she whispered. "I need to check the tape quality." Alonzo lied, his voice hoarse with emotions he was desperately trying to suppress. "Sometimes these old recordings, they can be damaged. Let me work on this alone and I'll bring it back to you tomorrow." But Dolores wasn't moving. Her maternal instincts, sharpened by 3 decades of grief and unanswered questions, detected something in his manner that didn't sit right. "Señor Alonso, what's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost." He had seen a ghost, or rather, heard one. The voice continuing to speak from the cassette player belonged to a man who had been dead for over a decade, a man whose accidental death in 1994 had been investigated by police and ruled a tragic collision with a drunk driver on the Queensboro Bridge. But Alonzo knew things about Father Malcolm that the police investigation had never uncovered, secrets that he had carried like a cancer in his chest since his own brief tenure as a seminarian at St. Helena 45 years ago. "The tape needs restoration," he managed to say, his craftsman's instincts providing a plausible excuse even as his mind reeled. "Old magnetic tape can be fragile. If we play it too much without proper preparation, we might lose whatever is recorded on it forever." It wasn't entirely a lie. Vintage audio tape did require careful handling. But what Alonzo really needed was time to process what he'd just heard, time to decide whether the truth contained in this confession was something that would heal Dolores or destroy her completely. As Dolores reluctantly agreed to leave the tape with him, Alonzo felt the weight of an impossible decision settling on his shoulders. In his pocket, his rosary beads clicked together as his nervous fingers worried them like a lifeline. He had prayed every day for 30 years that the truth about what happened at St. Helena would stay buried with the men who had participated in it. But now that truth was sitting on his workbench in the form of a $2 cassette tape, demanding to be heard. That evening, after Dolores had gone back to her apartment, Alonzo sat in his darkened living room and listened to the entire confession. He listened to Father Malcolm's voice describe necessary sacrifices and protecting the institution. He heard about the girl with the white ribbon and measures taken to ensure silence. Most devastating of all, he heard the former priest's anguished admission that she wasn't the only one, and his desperate plea for forgiveness from a God who might not be listening. When the tape finally clicked to silence, Alonzo was weeping, deep, racking sobs that seemed to emerge from a place in his soul that he had kept locked away since his own escape from seminary life decades ago. He wept for Claire, for Dolores, for all the secrets that institutions could bury beneath layers of respectability and false piety. But mostly, he wept for his own cowardice, the same weakness that had prevented him from speaking up all those years ago, when he'd first witnessed the kind of corruption that could destroy innocence with impunity. The next morning, when Dolores knocked on his door expecting to reclaim her tape, Alonzo made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He opened the door with red-rimmed eyes and a lie ready on his lips. "I'm sorry, Señora Rivera," he said, unable to meet her gaze. "The tape was too damaged. The playback mechanism destroyed it before I could hear what was on it." But as she turned to leave, something in her defeated posture, the way her shoulders sagged as if the last hope had been drained from her body, made him call out before he could stop himself. "Dolores, wait." His voice cracked on her name. Claire. She wasn't the only one. The words hung in the hallway between them like a bridge that, once crossed, could never be uncrossed again. The words, "she wasn't the only one," echoed in Dolores's mind, like a church bell tolling for the dead as she walked through the bustling streets of Queens 3 days later. Senior Alonzo's cryptic statement had unlocked something desperate and determined within her, a maternal fury that had been dormant for 30 years but now burned with the intensity of a votive candle that refuses to be extinguished. She had spent 72 hours making phone calls, visiting libraries, and pestering former neighbors until she'd assembled a list of every person who had worked at St. Helena Catholic School during the 1970s. Most of them were dead. Heart attacks, cancer, old age, the natural attrition that comes with the passage of 3 decades. But there was one name on the list that made her hands shake as she wrote it down. Sister Agnes Kowalski, age 86, resident of Sunset Manor Nursing Home in Elmhurst, Queens. According to the school's archived employee records that she'd convinced a sympathetic secretary to share, Sister Agnes had worked in the school's infirmary from 1972 to 1980, leaving abruptly in the middle of a school year for reasons that were listed simply as health concerns. The bus ride to Sunset Manor took 45 minutes through neighborhoods that grew progressively more institutional, past medical supply stores, pharmacies with roll-down security gates, and apartment buildings where the elderly waited behind lace curtains for visitors who rarely came. Dolores clutched her worn leather purse containing a small photo of Claire, the same school picture she'd carried to police stations and hospitals 30 years ago, its edges now soft from handling. Sunset Manor squatted on Northern Boulevard like a fortress of forgotten lives, its brick facade streaked with decades of weather and resignation. The lobby smelled of disinfectant, overcooked vegetables, and that particular odor of institutions where dignity goes to die slowly. A young receptionist with kind eyes and tired scrubs looked up from her computer as Dolores approached. "I'm here to visit Sister Agnes Kowalski," Dolores said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I'm an old friend from the church." The receptionist's expression grew cautious. "Sister Agnes has good days and bad days. Alzheimer's, you know. Sometimes she remembers the past clearly, but other times..." She shrugged with the practiced sympathy of someone who delivered similar warnings dozens of times each day. Sister Agnes sat in a wheelchair by the window of the community room, her once tall frame now curved into a question mark of age and infirmity. Her habit had been replaced by a simple blue cardigan and gray slacks, but her rosary beads were wound around her wrist like a lifeline to the faith that had defined her existence. Her eyes, clouded with cataracts but still sharp with intelligence, tracked Dolores's approach with the wariness of someone who had learned that unexpected visitors usually brought unwelcome news. "Sister Agnes?" Dolores pulled up a chair beside the wheelchair, noting how the elderly nun's hands trembled constantly, not from age, but from something that looked more like perpetual anxiety. "My name is Dolores Rivera. I wanted to ask you about St. Helena Catholic School." The reaction was immediate and devastating. Sister Agnes's entire body went rigid, her breathing became shallow and rapid, and her eyes darted around the room as if searching for an escape route that didn't exist. "No, no, no," she whispered, her voice carrying the particular terror of someone reliving a trauma that time had failed to heal. "I don't talk about that place. I don't talk about what we saw. Sister, please." Dolores reached out to touch the nun's arm, but Agnes flinched away as if she'd been burned. "I'm not here to hurt you, I just need to know about my daughter, about Claire." At the mention of the name, Sister Agnes stopped trembling and stared directly at Dolores with a clarity that was heartbreaking in its intensity. "Claire," she repeated, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "The girl with the white ribbon. She screamed, you know. She screamed so loud that we could hear her through the walls. But Father Malcolm said we had to pray instead of helping. He said prayer was the only thing that could save her soul." Dolores felt her world tilt on its axis. After 3 decades of wondering, of imagining every possible scenario, she was finally hearing confirmation that Claire had been alive somewhere in that school, suffering, while people who had taken vows to protect the innocent chose instead to close their eyes and ears. "Where did they take her?" Dolores asked, her voice hoarse with emotion. "Where in the school?" Sister Agnes's lucid moment flickered like a candle in wind. She began rocking back and forth in her wheelchair, a self-soothing motion that spoke of years spent trying to forget what couldn't be forgotten. "The basement," she murmured, "down the stairs behind the altar. There was a room, a special room where they took the girls who knew too much." "Girls? Plural?" But Sister Agnes was slipping away again, retreating into the safer confusion of dementia. She began reciting the Hail Mary in Latin, her voice taking on the mechanical cadence of someone who had used prayer as a shield against unbearable memories. Dolores visited Sunset Manor 4 more times over the next 2 weeks. Most days, Sister Agnes didn't remember her, didn't remember Claire, didn't remember anything beyond the bland routine of institutional meals and medication schedules. But on the 5th visit, during a brief window of clarity that came just after morning mass in the nursing home's small chapel, the elderly nun grabbed Dolores's wrist with surprising strength. "You have to go back there," Sister Agnes whispered urgently. "To the basement. Behind the altar, there's a door that looks like part of the wall. That's where they kept her. That's where she made the recording." "Recording?" Dolores's heart stopped. "What recording?" She was clever, that one. Found a way to leave a message. Hidden it where she knew someone would eventually find it. In the holy book. The broken holy book. Sister Agnes's grip loosened, and she sank back into her wheelchair, exhausted by the effort of remembering. But her eyes remained fixed on Dolores with desperate intensity. "Promise me," the nun whispered. "Promise me you'll find what she left behind. Promise me her voice won't be lost forever." That evening, Dolores stood outside St. Helena Catholic School for the first time in 30 years. The building looked smaller than she remembered, more ordinary, just another institutional structure among the gentrified blocks of Manhattan's Upper East Side. But as she studied the basement windows that faced the side street, she could imagine Claire's face pressed against the glass, calling for help that never came. The current janitor, a young Dominican man named Carlos, recognized her from her daily cleaning work at the church. When she explained that she needed to check the basement storage area for some old records, he didn't question her request. In their community, Mothers searching for closure were given the respect and assistance that grief demanded. The basement was a maze of storage rooms, mechanical equipment, and shadows that seemed to move independently of any light source. But behind the room that housed the church's main altar, just as Sister Agnes had described, Dolores found a section of wall that didn't quite match the rest. Her fingers traced the edges until she located a hidden latch, and the false panel swung inward to reveal a space that had been sealed for decades. The room beyond was small, perhaps 8 feet by 10, with a cot that had long since rotted away and restraints mounted to the wall that made Dolores's stomach churn with rage and horror. But in the corner, partially hidden beneath a pile of moldy blankets, she found what Sister Agnes had sent her to discover: a Bible with a cracked leather cover and pages that had been carefully hollowed out to create a hiding space. Inside that makeshift cavity, wrapped in what had once been a white lace cloth, was another cassette tape. This one was smaller than the confession tape Alonzo had found, a microcassette of the type used in handheld recorders. The label was written in a young girl's careful script, the kind of penmanship taught by strict Catholic school nuns. For Mama, if anything happens to me. As Dolores clutched the tape to her chest in that horrible basement room, she could feel Claire's presence more strongly than she had since the day her daughter disappeared. This was her little girl's voice, preserved across 3 decades of silence, waiting to tell her mother the truth that powerful men had killed to keep hidden. But as she turned to leave that chamber of horrors, Dolores noticed something else that made her blood run cold. Scratched into the concrete wall above where the cot had been, barely visible in the dim light, were more words in that same careful script. "They said I would never see you again, Mama, but I found a way." Dolores sat in her small kitchen at 3:17 a.m., the microcassette tape placed on the worn Formica table like a sacred relic that might crumble to dust if handled too roughly. The overhead light cast harsh shadows across her weathered face as she stared at the tiny device that contained what might be the last words her daughter had ever spoken. Her hand shook as she held the small Sony recorder she'd borrowed from Mrs. Gonzalez next door, the same device the elderly woman used to record messages for her grandchildren in Puerto Rico. The apartment was silent except for the distant hum of traffic on FDR Drive and the occasional creak of the old building settling into another restless night. Dolores had already called in sick to her morning cleaning job at the hospital, knowing that whatever she was about to hear would leave her in no condition to scrub floors or empty bedpans while maintaining the composed facade that her employers expected from their invisible workforce. She pressed play with trembling fingers, and for a moment there was nothing but the soft hiss of ancient magnetic tape. Then, like a voice calling across an impossible chasm of time and grief, Claire's 14-year-old whisper emerged from the tiny speaker. "Mama, if someone finds this, it means I didn't make it home like I promised." The voice was unmistakably Claire's, that slight lisp she'd never quite outgrown, the way she pronounced her R's with just a hint of her mother's Puerto Rican accent despite being born in New York. But there was something else in her daughter's voice that made Dolores's heart shatter, terror so profound that each word seemed to require enormous courage to speak. "I'm in a room in the basement of the school. I don't know exactly where, but it's behind the chapel somewhere. There's no windows and the door is locked from the outside." There was a pause, filled with the sound of Claire's frightened breathing, and something else. The distant sound of footsteps echoing through what must have been stone corridors. Dolores pressed the recorder closer to her ear, desperate to catch every nuance of her daughter's voice, every detail that might explain what had happened during those final, terrifying hours. "Sister Eliza brought me here after catechism class. She said Father Malcolm needed to speak with me privately about something important, something about confession. But when we got down here..." Claire's voice broke into a sob that reached across 30 years and tore through Dolores's chest like a physical wound. "Mama, she's not really a nun. I heard her talking to Father Malcolm and she called him brother. She said they had to keep me quiet because I saw something I shouldn't have seen." The recording continued with agonizing clarity, each word a testament to Claire's intelligence and desperate hope that someone would eventually hear her story. She described being given injections that made her drowsy, being chained to a cot when she tried to escape, and overhearing conversations between Father Malcolm and his sister about handling the situation before it could damage the school's reputation. I saw them in Father Malcolm's office 3 days ago, Mama. Sister Eliza wasn't wearing her habit. She was in regular clothes and she was giving him money. Lots of money. And there were other men there, men in expensive suits who didn't look like they belonged in a church. They were talking about moving things, about making problems disappear. And then Father Malcolm saw me listening at the door. Dolores felt bile rise in her throat as the full scope of the conspiracy began to reveal itself. This wasn't just about silencing one curious teenager. Claire had stumbled upon something much larger, something that involved people with enough power and resources to make a 14-year-old girl vanish without a trace. The tape continued with Claire's voice growing weaker, the effects of whatever drugs they'd been giving her becoming more pronounced. But her determination to leave a record of what was happening to her never wavered. Sister Eliza keeps telling me that God has a plan, that sometimes innocent people have to suffer for the greater good. She says the work they're doing here is too important to be stopped by one girl's curiosity. But Mama, I've seen other girls down here. Not alive, just pictures. Pictures of girls who look like they were my age with dates written on the back going back years and years. The revelation hit Dolores like a physical blow. Other girls. Other daughters who had disappeared into this nightmare and never emerged. Other mothers who had spent sleepless nights wondering if their children were alive or dead, never knowing that the answer lay hidden beneath the floors of an institution they'd trusted with their most precious possessions. I found this recorder in a box of old things in the corner. Claire's voice continued, growing more distant as the drugs in her system took hold. Sister Eliza must have forgotten it was here. I'm hiding the tape inside a Bible I found, one that's been torn apart probably by another girl who was trapped here before me. If anything happens to me, Mama, I want you to know that I tried to be brave like you always taught me. I tried to find a way home. There was a long pause in the recording, filled only with the sound of Claire's labored breathing and the distant echo of voices coming closer. When she spoke again, her words were slurred but filled with desperate urgency. They're coming back. Sister Eliza has a needle and she says this one will help me sleep forever. She says it's merciful, that God doesn't want me to suffer anymore. But Mama, I'm not ready to die. I had so much I wanted to tell you, so many things I wanted to do. I wanted to graduate high school and maybe go to college like we talked about. I wanted to dance at my wedding someday and give you grandchildren who would run around our apartment and drive you crazy with their noise and laughter. The footsteps in the corridor were growing louder now, accompanied by voices that Claire seemed to recognize. Her whispered words came faster, racing against time. Tell Mrs. Rodriguez I'm sorry I can't help her with her groceries anymore. Tell Father Martinez, the young priest who comes sometimes, tell him that some of the older priests aren't who they pretend to be. And Mama, tell Senior Alonso that his daughter didn't run away like everyone said. She's down here too in the photographs. Her name was written on the back, Maria Elena Vega, age 15, 1963. Dolores gasped audibly. Senior Alonso's daughter, the one he'd claimed had run off with a boyfriend when she was a teenager, the loss that had driven his wife to an early grave from grief. She hadn't run away at all. She had been another victim of this systematic horror that had been operating beneath their noses for decades. The recording device seemed to be concealed now, the sound muffled as if Claire had hidden it beneath clothing or bedding. Through the distortion, Dolores could hear her daughter's final words. I love you, Mama. More than all the stars in the sky, remember? That's what Papa used to say, and now I'm going to see him soon. But please don't let them bury this truth with me. Don't let other little girls end up down here because nobody was brave enough to speak up. You raised me to fight for what's right, and now I need you to fight for me. The voices were in the room now, Sister Eliza's falsely gentle tone mixing with Father Malcolm's cold authority. The tape captured Claire's terrified whimpering, the sound of restraints being fastened, and then Sister Eliza's voice clear and chilling. This will only hurt for a moment, child. Then you'll be with Jesus, and all of this worldly suffering will be over. No, please, Claire whispered, her voice barely audible. Please, I promise I won't tell anyone. I just want to go home to my mama." The last sound on the tape was Claire calling out one final time, "Mama, I love you. Remember the white ribbon? Remember me." Then silence. Eternal, devastating silence. Dolores sat in her kitchen as dawn broke over Manhattan, tears streaming down her face as she clutched the recorder to her chest. Her daughter's voice had reached across 3 decades of grief to tell her the truth. But with that truth came a rage so pure and consuming that it threatened to burn away everything she'd built her life around since Claire's disappearance. Her little girl hadn't run away. She hadn't been kidnapped by strangers. She had been murdered by people who wore crosses around their necks and spoke of God's mercy while committing acts of unspeakable evil. And according to Claire's final testimony, she hadn't been the first victim, nor would she have been the last if this conspiracy hadn't been interrupted by whatever had caused Father Malcolm and Sister Eliza to disappear from the scene in the years following Claire's death. As the sun rose higher, painting the kitchen walls gold with morning light, Dolores made a decision that would have made her daughter proud. She wasn't going to let Claire's courage and sacrifice be buried beneath decades of institutional silence. She was going to make sure that the world heard every word of that tape, no matter who tried to stop her. The fight for justice that Claire had started with her hidden recording was about to begin. 3 days after listening to Claire's final testimony, Dolores walked into the offices of Channel 7 Eyewitness News on Columbus Avenue with the determination of a woman who had nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. The newsroom buzzed with the controlled chaos of modern journalism, reporters hunched over computers, phones ringing constantly, and the distant murmur of live broadcasts filtering through the glass walls of the main studio. She clutched her worn leather purse containing both cassette tapes, the photographs she'd managed to take of the basement room, and a handwritten timeline of events that she'd spent 72 hours compiling with obsessive precision. The receptionist, a young woman with perfectly styled hair and the practiced smile of someone trained to deflect unwanted visitors, looked up from her computer with polite disinterest. "Can I help you?" "I need to speak with a reporter," Dolores said, her voice carrying an authority that surprised even herself. "I have information about missing children, about murders that were covered up by the Catholic Church 30 years ago." The words Catholic Church and cover-up had an immediate effect. Within 10 minutes, Dolores found herself sitting across from Marcus Webb, an investigative reporter in his early 30s, whose reputation for exposing institutional corruption had earned him both awards and enemies in equal measure. His dark eyes studied Dolores with the intensity of someone who had learned to separate genuine whistleblowers from attention-seeking fantasists within the first few minutes of an interview. "Mrs. Rivera," Marcus said, settling into his chair with a legal pad and digital recorder. "Tell me about your daughter." For the next 2 hours, Dolores laid out the entire story, from Claire's disappearance in 1976 to the discovery of the tapes, from Sister Agnes's fragmented memories to the horror of the basement room. Marcus listened without interruption, occasionally making notes but mostly just absorbing the magnitude of what she was revealing. When she played portions of both recordings, his professional composure cracked, and she could see the same outrage building in his eyes that had been consuming her for days. This is extraordinary," Marcus said when she'd finished. "But I need to verify everything before we can move forward. The names you've mentioned, Father Malcolm, this Sister Eliza, I need to research their backgrounds, find documentation that supports your daughter's testimony." "How long will that take?" Dolores asked, anxiety creeping into her voice. She'd waited 30 years for answers. The thought of waiting even a few more days felt unbearable. "Give me a week," Marcus promised. "Maybe less if I can access the right archives." But it took only 3 days for Marcus to call with news that left Dolores speechless. She met him at a coffee shop near Lincoln Center, where he spread a collection of documents across their small table like pieces of a puzzle that had finally begun to form a complete picture. "I found her," Marcus said, his voice tight with excitement and revulsion. "Sister Eliza. Her real name was Elizabeth Malcolm, Father Thomas Malcolm's younger sister." The revelation hit Dolores like a physical blow. She had suspected some connection between the two, but the reality was somehow worse than anything she'd imagined. His sister? Born in 1934 in Buffalo, New York. She trained as a psychiatric nurse at Buffalo State Hospital, where she worked from 1955 to 1962. But here's where it gets interesting. She was dismissed from her position for inappropriate treatment methods involving child patients. The official records are sealed, but I found a newspaper article from 1963 that mentions a nurse named E. Malcolm being investigated for administering experimental drugs to minors without parental consent. Marcus pulled out a yellowed newspaper clipping, its headline barely legible. Hospital nurse under investigation for patient abuse. The accompanying photograph showed a stern-faced woman in her 30s wearing a nurse's uniform, her expression cold and calculating in a way that made Dolores's skin crawl. She never actually took religious vows, Marcus continued. The nun's habit was a disguise, probably arranged by her brother to give her authority within the school environment. According to employment records I found in the diocesan archives, she worked as a volunteer medical consultant at St. Helena from 1970 to 1982, handling what they called special health situations for problem students. The euphemism made Dolores sick to her stomach. Problem students like Claire who had seen too much and asked too many questions. "There's more," Marcus said, pulling out another set of documents. "I found records of unusual deaths and disappearances connected to Catholic institutions throughout the Northeast during the 1960s and 70s. Young people, mostly girls between the ages of 13 and 17, who were reported as runaways by church authorities but whose families insisted they would never have left voluntarily." He spread out a map marked with red pins, each one representing a location where similar incidents had occurred. The pattern was unmistakable. A trail of tragedy that followed the career paths of certain clergy members as they were transferred from parish to parish, institution to institution. "I think we're looking at a systematic operation," Marcus explained, his voice grim. "Not just one rogue priest and his sister, but an organized network that used the church's authority and resources to silence potential witnesses to other crimes. Financial fraud, political corruption, possibly even organized crime connections." The scope of the conspiracy was staggering, but what came next shattered what was left of Dolores's world. Marcus hesitated before pulling out the final document, a birth certificate that looked far too recent to be connected to events from the 1970s. "Dolores, I need you to prepare yourself for this," he said gently. "While I was researching Elizabeth Malcolm's disappearance in 1982, I found something else. Something that might explain why your daughter was targeted specifically." The birth certificate was dated March 15, 1977, exactly 6 months after Claire's disappearance. The child's name was listed as Hope Jennings, and the mother's name made Dolores's vision blur with shock and disbelief. "Claire Maria Jennings. That's impossible," Dolores whispered, her voice barely audible. "Claire was only 14. She was just a child herself." Marcus's expression was filled with compassion and rage. "According to the medical records I was able to access through a contact at the hospital, Claire was pregnant when she disappeared. The birth took place at a private facility in Westchester County, a place that specialized in discreet medical services for wealthy families dealing with delicate situations. The implications crashed over Dolores like a tsunami of horror and heartbreak. Her daughter hadn't just been murdered for witnessing criminal activity. She had been kept alive long enough to give birth to a child conceived through rape, a baby who represented evidence that could have destroyed the entire conspiracy if the truth had ever come to light." "Where is she?" Dolores asked, her grandmother's instincts awakening with fierce intensity. "Where is my granddaughter?" Marcus pulled out one final document, adoption papers showing that baby Hope had been placed with a Catholic family in Queens through a private agency that had since been shut down for irregular practices. The adoptive parents were listed as Robert and Margaret Thomas, and their address was less than 5 miles from where Dolores had spent 30 years grieving for her lost daughter. The family changed her name to Elena Thomas, Marcus explained. She grew up believing her parents had died in a car accident. But Dolores, I have to tell you something else. Elena Thomas died in 2003. She was 26 years old, killed in what was officially ruled a random mugging in Central Park. Another death. Another young woman whose life had been cut short, possibly because someone feared she might start asking questions about her true identity. But as Marcus continued reading from his notes, he revealed one more piece of information that changed everything. Elena had a son before she died, a little boy named Eli. He was raised by his mother's adoptive parents, but they died when he was 18. He's been on his own ever since. Dolores felt her heart stop. How old would he be now? 29, Marcus replied. And Dolores, there's something else. Something that's either the most incredible coincidence in history or evidence that some kind of justice exists in this world. He pulled out one final photograph, a driver's license photo that showed a young man with Claire's distinctive eyes and the same gentle smile that had lit up Dolores's world 30 years ago. Eli Thomas works as a construction contractor here in Manhattan, specializes in historical restoration projects, and according to the work orders I found. Marcus paused, letting the weight of what he was about to say settle in the air between them. He's the one who discovered the first cassette tape. Eli Thomas is the contractor who was renovating the confessional at St. Helena Church. Your grandson found the evidence that led you to the truth about his mother. The revelation was so profound, so impossibly perfect in its symmetry, that Dolores could only sit in stunned silence as the pieces of a 30-year-old puzzle finally clicked into place. Claire's son, her grandson, had been the instrument of his own mother's justice, unknowingly uncovering the secrets that would finally bring her killers to light. Somewhere in the chaos of Manhattan, a young man was going about his daily life completely unaware that he carried his murdered mother's DNA and his grandmother's unbreakable determination to see justice done. But that was about to change. Dolores looked at Marcus with eyes that burned with purpose. I need to meet him. I need to meet my grandson. The construction site on East 84th Street buzzed with the controlled chaos of urban renovation, the sound of power tools and heavy machinery creating a symphony that had become the soundtrack of Manhattan's endless transformation. Eli Thomas knelt on the sidewalk beside his work truck, carefully sorting through a collection of vintage brass fixtures he'd salvaged from a 1920s brownstone, his calloused hands treating each piece with the reverence of an archaeologist handling ancient artifacts. At 29, he had inherited his adoptive grandfather's passion for preserving the past, finding beauty in the forgotten details that most people walked past without noticing. He was completely unaware that 2 blocks away, an elderly Puerto Rican woman sat in a coffee shop, clutching a faded photograph and gathering the courage to approach the grandson she'd never known existed until 3 days ago. Dolores had spent those 72 hours studying every piece of information Marcus had gathered about Eli's life, his work history, his reputation among contractors for meticulous craftsmanship, the small apartment in Astoria where he lived alone with a rescue dog named Murphy. But none of those facts had prepared her for the emotional earthquake of seeing Claire's eyes looking back at her from a stranger's face. The meeting had been arranged through Marcus, who had contacted Eli under the pretense of researching a story about historical preservation in New York. The reporter had been careful not to reveal the true nature of their interest, knowing that the revelation of Eli's parentage needed to come gently, with proper context and emotional support. They had agreed to meet at Riverside Park on a bench overlooking the Hudson River, where the autumn light would be soft and the ambient noise of traffic would provide privacy for a conversation that would change a young man's understanding of his entire existence. Eli arrived first, his work boots crunching through fallen leaves as he approached the designated meeting spot. He was tall like his mother had been, with the same unruly brown hair that refused to stay completely neat, despite his obvious attempts to tame it for this mysterious interview. He carried himself with the confident ease of someone comfortable with physical labor, but there was something in his posture, a slight guardedness around the shoulders, that suggested a man who had learned early to be self-reliant in a world that didn't always offer second chances. When Dolores appeared on the pathway, walking slowly with Marcus beside her for moral support, Eli's first thought was how small and fragile she looked against the backdrop of the city skyline. But as she drew closer, something indefinable made him straighten in recognition, not of her face, which he'd never seen before, but of something deeper, some genetic memory that whispered of shared blood and common ground. Eli? Dolores's voice carried the musical cadence of her Puerto Rican heritage, made more pronounced by emotion. My name is Dolores Rivera. I asked Mr. Webb to arrange this meeting because... She faltered, looking at Marcus for encouragement. Because I have something to tell you about your family. About your real family. The words hit Eli like a physical blow. He had long ago accepted that his biological parents were unknown, that the car accident story his adoptive parents had told him was probably fiction, designed to protect him from harsher truths. But there was something in this elderly woman's eyes, a desperate hope mixed with profound grief, that suggested the real story was more complex than simple abandonment or tragedy. I don't understand, Eli said, his voice careful and controlled. My adoptive parents told me that both my biological parents died before I was old enough to remember them. Dolores reached into her purse with trembling hands and withdrew the photograph of Claire in her confirmation dress, the same image that had sustained her through 30 years of unanswered questions. When she held it out to Eli, his sharp intake of breath confirmed what she had suspected from the moment she'd seen his driver's license photo. This is your mother, Dolores whispered. Her name was Claire Maria Jennings, and she was my daughter. Your mother was 14 years old when she was murdered, but she lived long enough to give birth to you. The world seemed to tilt around Eli as he stared at the photograph. The resemblance was unmistakable. The same eyes, the same smile, the same slightly stubborn set to the jaw that he saw in his mirror every morning. But the girl in the photo was impossibly young, a child wearing the white dress of innocence, holding a prayer book with hands that seemed too small to have created life. Murdered. The word came out as barely more than a whisper. Marcus opened his briefcase and withdrew copies of the documents he'd assembled. Birth certificates, newspaper clippings, medical records that painted a picture of systematic abuse and institutional cover-up spanning decades. As he explained the discovery of the confession tape, the hidden basement room and Claire's desperate final recording, Eli's face went through a series of transformations that broke Dolores's heart all over again. Confusion gave way to horror, horror to rage, and finally rage to a profound sadness that seemed to age him years in the space of minutes. When Marcus played portions of Claire's tape, her young voice speaking directly to the mother she would never see again, her courage in the face of unimaginable terror, Eli buried his face in his hands and wept with the abandoned grief of someone discovering that their entire life had been built on lies. She was so brave, he said finally, his voice thick with tears. She was just a kid, and she was braver than most adults I know. Dolores reached out tentatively and touched his shoulder, the first physical contact between grandmother and grandson. She would have loved you so much, she whispered. She would have been so proud of the man you became. For the next hour, they sat on that bench while Dolores filled in the gaps of Eli's understanding, telling him about Claire's childhood, her love of reading and dancing, her dreams of college and the future that had been stolen from her. She described the neighborhood where his mother had grown up, the friends who still remembered her kindness, the teachers who had recognized her intelligence and potential. I have something else to show you, Dolores said eventually, pulling out the microcassette recorder. Your mother. She left a message. For me, but also for you, I think. She didn't know she was pregnant yet, but somehow I think she knew that part of her would survive. They listened to Claire's final testimony together, and when his mother's voice spoke of wanting to dance at her wedding someday and give her mother grandchildren, Eli sobbed with the recognition that those dreams had been fulfilled in ways that Claire could never have imagined. Through him, through his existence, she had indeed given Dolores a grandchild, a piece of herself that had survived the darkness and grown into someone who honored her memory through his work preserving the past. I want to do something, Eli said when the recording ended. I want to make sure everyone knows what happened to her. What happened to all of them. Marcus nodded approvingly. The story is ready to run, but it will be stronger with your participation, your perspective as her son, as someone who unknowingly uncovered the evidence that brought this to light. As the sun began to set over the Hudson River, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that reminded Dolores of the autumn afternoon when Claire had disappeared. 3 generations of the same family sat together on a park bench, planning how to ensure that a 14-year-old girl's courage would finally receive the recognition it deserved. Eli looked at his grandmother, and how strange and wonderful it felt to have a grandmother again, with eyes that burned with the same determination that had carried Claire through her final hours. "When do we start?" he asked. Dolores smiled through her tears, seeing Claire's stubborn nobility reflected in her son's face. "We already have, mijo. We already have." That night, Eli called his construction crew and told them to prepare for a different kind of demolition project. Tomorrow they would begin tearing down 30 years of silence, brick by brick, until the truth stood naked and undeniable in the light of day. The revolution that Claire had started with her hidden cassette tape was about to reach its crescendo, and her son would be the one to carry it across the finish line. The Channel 7 newsroom fell into absolute silence at 6:47 p.m. on November 15, 2006, as Claire Jennings' voice emerged from television speakers across the tri-state area for the first time in 30 years. Marcus Webb's investigative report, titled "The White Ribbon Conspiracy," had taken 3 weeks to produce and verify, but its impact was instantaneous and devastating. Within minutes of the broadcast, the station's phone lines were overwhelmed with calls from viewers who recognized names, places, and patterns that connected to their own family tragedies. Dolores sat in her small apartment, surrounded by neighbors who had gathered to watch the broadcast together, their faces reflecting the same mixture of vindication and heartbreak that had consumed her for weeks. "Nice." Gonzalez held her hand tightly as Claire's young voice filled the room, speaking with a clarity and courage that reduced grown adults to tears. When the segment ended with Eli's emotional interview, his declaration that he would dedicate his life to honoring his mother's memory by exposing institutional corruption, the apartment erupted in applause and tears. But the real earthquake began the following morning. By 8 a.m., picketers had gathered outside the Archdiocese offices on First Avenue, holding signs with Claire's confirmation photo and demanding justice for victims of clergy abuse. By noon, 3 more families had come forward with evidence of similar disappearances connected to St. Helena and other Catholic institutions throughout the Northeast. By evening, FBI agents were executing search warrants at church properties, removing boxes of documents that had been sealed in basement archives for decades. The church's response was swift and predictable. Cardinal Morrison, speaking from behind a podium flanked by lawyers, offered the standard formula of prayers for healing and promises of cooperation with law enforcement. But his words rang hollow against the backdrop of Claire's recorded testimony, and protesters shouted him down with chants of "Justice for Claire" that echoed through the stone corridors of St. Patrick's Cathedral. Senior Alonzo appeared at Dolores's door 3 days after the broadcast, his weathered face streaked with tears and his hands shaking as he carried a shoebox filled with photographs and letters he'd hidden for 43 years. His daughter Maria Elena's face smiled up from dozens of pictures, quinceañera celebrations, family gatherings, school events, documenting a life that had been cut short at 15 and buried beneath lies about teenage rebellion and runaway fantasies. "I should have spoken up," he whispered to Dolores as they sat at her kitchen table, 2 parents united by decades of grief and the terrible knowledge that their silence had allowed other children to suffer. When Maria Elena disappeared, I knew something was wrong. But Father Malcolm convinced me that scandal would only hurt the community, that good Catholic families needed to trust in God's plan even when it seemed incomprehensible. The revelation that Alonzo's daughter had been another victim of the same conspiracy that killed Claire added new fuel to the growing firestorm. Within days, he had joined Dolores and Eli in their media appearances, his carpenter's hand steady as he held up his daughter's photograph and demanded accountability from the institution that had betrayed their trust so completely. The legal ramifications moved with surprising speed. District Attorney Patricia Rodriguez, a Puerto Rican woman whose own mother had cleaned offices in the financial district, announced the formation of a special task force to investigate historical crimes connected to Catholic institutions. Although the primary perpetrators were dead, Father Malcolm in his suspicious 1994 car accident, Elizabeth Malcolm mysteriously disappeared in 1982. The conspiracy had involved enough living participants to support multiple prosecutions. Dr. James Whitmore, the physician who had delivered Claire's baby in that Westchester County facility, was arrested at his retirement home in Florida on charges of conspiracy and facilitating human trafficking. 3 former diocesan officials were indicted for obstruction of justice and accessory to murder. Most significantly, the private adoption agency that had placed baby Hope with the Thomas family was revealed to be a front operation for selling children born to abuse victims, with profits shared between church officials and organized crime figures who had used the trafficking network to launder money and eliminate witnesses. But for Dolores, the most meaningful moment came on a cold December morning when she and Eli walked together through the iron gates of St. Helena Catholic School for the last time. The building had been shuttered by the Archdiocese pending investigation, its windows boarded up and its doors chained shut like the tomb it had always been. But Eli had obtained permission from the city to perform one final restoration project on the property. Using sledgehammers and crowbars, they methodically demolished the basement room where Claire had been held captive, every blow striking against the concrete walls that had witnessed unspeakable horrors. As the false panels came down, and the hidden chambers were exposed to daylight for the first time in decades, Dolores felt a profound sense of liberation, as if her daughter's spirit was finally being released from the darkness that had claimed her life. In the debris, Eli found one final piece of evidence, a small white satin ribbon, miraculously preserved in a crack between 2 concrete blocks. It was the same ribbon Claire had worn in her hair the day she disappeared, the one that had belonged to her father, and carried the memory of better times. Dolores held it to her lips and whispered a prayer of gratitude for the daughter who had refused to let death silence her voice. The media attention eventually faded, as it always does, but the changes Claire's story had set in motion continued to ripple outward. Mandatory reporting laws were strengthened, victim advocacy programs received increased funding, and a scholarship fund established in Claire's name provided college educations for young women from low-income families who demonstrated the same courage and determination that had defined her short life. Eli left his construction business to become a full-time advocate for abuse survivors, traveling the country to speak at conferences and support groups. His message was simple but powerful. Secrets lose their ability to destroy when they're brought into the light, and even the most powerful institutions cannot survive indefinitely when their crimes are witnessed by people brave enough to speak truth. On the first anniversary of the broadcast, Dolores stood at Claire's grave for the first time in 30 years with something she'd never thought she would possess: peace. The headstone, originally marked simply, "Beloved Daughter," now bore the fuller truth: Claire Maria Jennings, 1962-1976. Beloved daughter, devoted mother, courage that changed the world. As she placed fresh white gardenias on the grave, Dolores felt a presence she recognized immediately. Not the desperate, suffering ghost that had haunted her dreams for decades, but the joyful, laughing girl who had filled their apartment with music and hope. Claire was finally at rest, her mission complete, her voice heard, her courage honored. "Mija," Dolores whispered to the autumn wind. "You came home after all. In the most beautiful way possible, you came home." Behind her, Eli knelt to place his own flowers, a single white ribbon tied around a bouquet of roses, and spoke the words his mother had never gotten to hear. "Te amo, Mommy. I love you too, more than all the stars in the sky." The truth had set them all free, just as Claire had always believed it would. The end. Claire Jennings was just 14 years old when her courage in the face of unimaginable terror saved countless other children from suffering the same fate. Her story forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about the institutions we trust and the silence that allows evil to flourish in sacred spaces. What would you have done in Dolores's position, waiting 30 years for answers that seemed impossible to find? Would you have had the strength to keep searching when everyone else told you to let the past rest? And if you were Eli, discovering that your entire life had been built on lies and tragedy, Would you have chosen revenge or justice? Perhaps the most profound lesson from Claire's story is that truth has a way of surfacing, no matter how deeply it's buried or how powerful the forces trying to keep it hidden. A 14-year-old girl's refusal to die in silence became the key that unlocked decades of institutional corruption, proving that even the smallest voice can change the world when it speaks with absolute courage. Her final act of hiding that cassette tape wasn't just about exposing her killers. It was about ensuring that her life would have meaning beyond her death, that her suffering would prevent other children from experiencing the same horror. The white ribbon Claire wore in her hair that last day became a symbol of innocence lost but never forgotten, a reminder that justice sometimes comes not through the courts or the powerful, but through the unbreakable love between mothers and children that transcends even death itself. If this story moved you, please subscribe to our channel, hit that like button, and share it with others who believe that every voice deserves to be heard, no matter how long it takes for the truth to find its way to the light.